Now, I have worked for enough campaigns to know that this is sometimes the most dangerous part of a candidacy. Not when you got your back against the wall, but when you're feeling good. What is the strategy? I mean, in all these wins last night, 10 states, and we're not done with the counting, with no ads up, I don't think, in any of those states, very few field offices in any of those states, no travel in a lot of those states. How do you keep the results from last night while also scaling a national campaign?
Well, look, Nicole, it's just like we drew it up. I mean, no, look, I think what we have to I think what we have to do is continue to do what's working. What's working is people hearing Joe Biden's message. Look, we live in a national media environment. When he comes on shows like your show a week ago and other shows, people across the country in all these states hear him. And I do want to correct one thing about no travel. Some of those states the vice president didn't visit, but Dr. Jill Biden visited a lot of those states. She spent time in Tennessee and Oklahoma and Arkansas, and she's been a real secret weapon for the Biden campaign in all this.
So I think I'm glad you made that point. And with people that prevail, the spouse is such an important. They can say things about their spouses, about the candidate that they don't say about themselves. I take your note. Fair point.
But look, I think that going forward, you know, what the vice president said last night in his victory speech on Super Tuesday about this being a campaign for everyone who's been left behind and knocked down and left out, that is a powerful message that's resonating with voters. You matched it with people feeling his character. You know, I think those three endorsements on the day before Super Tuesday, what really struck me about them was just the emotion of those endorsements from those people who had been the vice president's opponents in this race, saying just not just political things, but genuinely affectionate things about him. He is a candidate who wears his heart on his sleeve. Voters are reacting to that. He is the antithesis of Donald Trump in this moment, someone who brings class and compassion and decency and a real passion to do things for people. I think that's really winning voters over at this moment.
What is the strategy for dealing with the Bernie Sanders? It's almost a Trumpian effort to brand Joe Biden as the product or the beneficiary of some Democratic establishment, which I think I know politics well enough to know that the Democratic establishment really had very little to do with Saturday night's victory in South Carolina.
Well, Nicole, as you said, Vice President Biden won in South Carolina thanks to a great endorsement from Whip Clyburn, no question. But in the end, thanks to the votes of African-American voters who obviously were not heard in Iowa, were not heard in New Hampshire, really weren't heard that much in Nevada, got their voices, got their chance to be heard in South Carolina, got their chance to be heard in Virginia and North Carolina and across Super Tuesday. And those people, they are not the party's establishment. They are the party's heart and soul and base. And any candidate who cannot get those votes cannot be the Democratic Party nominee. As Whip Clyburn said, they know Joe Biden. Joe Biden knows them. That's an emotional bond. We saw Senator Sanders this morning. He has a new ad. It's a picture of him and Barack Obama walking around the White House. And so, like, he's trying to fix this. Too little, too late. I think he's not going to be able to break that tie.
What is the strategy if Joe Biden is successful, does rack up enough delegates to become the party's nomination, to try to bring Bernie Sanders voters into the fold so that if Joe Biden is the nominee, he faces Donald Trump with the strongest and most diverse coalition of Democratic voters behind him?
Well, first of all, we have a long way to go to get there. This is a hard fight, and we know that Senator Sanders and the supporters are in it to win it like we are, and we expect really robust contests in the week ahead. But what you heard the vice president say last night in his acceptance speeches, he didn't attack Senator Sanders and his supporters. He didn't disparage them. He was talking about bringing everyone together, being a uniter as well as a fighter of all the Democrats and the independents, and yes, Republicans too, to get this country back from Donald Trump and to move this country forward. And that's been his message all along in this campaign. Sometimes people underestimated that. They said this is a party that doesn't want to unite, or this is a really feisty moment, and it is a feisty moment. But I think people want decency and they want a big tent, and that's what Joe Biden's bringing to this.
You know, Basil, I think Ron's made a couple of important points, but one about how close attention people are paying to news events. I mean, there weren't a lot of ads up, and Jill Biden is a powerful surrogate, but you just simply cannot get in front of every voter in every Super Tuesday state. This was the power of the win. This was a signal that African-American voters in South Carolina sent, that the only parallel I can think of was the signal white caucus goers in Iowa sent in 2008 when they delivered President Obama that win, and then the electability question was suddenly answered for all Democratic primary voters.
Well, I actually have been thinking about this because I don't know any singular elected official that has as much sway over a tremendous number of votes in a particular constituency as Jim Clyburn. So I've been thinking, where have I seen that before? And I actually remember 2008, Congressman John Lewis. He endorsed Hillary Clinton, but his district went 3-1 for Obama. And he made this incredibly difficult decision to switch his vote from Hillary to Obama. And it changed everything in that race. Some different circumstances, there's no question about
Always,
it.
right.
But what he was saying was, for the future of my party, for these young people that are pushing me in this direction, I have to make this decision. And so what I think about now is whether or not, because of the generational cleavage that Steve was talking about earlier, because we have this generational divide, are we going to see a prolonged divide between these younger voters who do want substantial change? And it's not an indictment of Bernie Sanders' policies. I understand the fervor there. But these older voters that say, I know Joe, I've been with him with all his faults. This is a person that represents the party that has provided political, social, economic power for me and for my family. And I think that's why you've seen so many voters move in that direction.
And that it wasn't even close. I mean, just to follow on to your point, it wasn't even close. And because I think what the Bernie Sanders base feels like is it isn't enough, right? I mean, the policies that Bernie is behind would represent such a dramatic overhaul. Joe Biden's are dramatically different from Donald Trump's, but very much a continuation of the policies that President Obama had put in motion and had advanced and had fought for. That's what drove record turnout. And it's not incrementalism, it's a lot more than that. But it's just interesting that the revolution didn't drive the turnout. It was a return to policies in line with or a continuation of the Obama policies.
Well, and I think I have been so focused on watching the passion that is driving Bernie Sanders and his revolution that I missed just how strong the fervor to get Donald Trump out of office is.
Me
It's
too.
what we saw in
Perfectly
2018.
said.
It's what we saw in the midterms. We saw how people came out in record numbers, and just the numbers of people who came out, who were willing to wait in line for hours and
7 hours in
and
Texas.
hours.
That's right.
That is the passion that Donald Trump is up against.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.